What's up, guys? It's Toad back again. Another episode of Better Off Dead. College football, week 9. I even said it last week, but the season is almost over, man. It's pretty wild. It's pretty crazy. I had a couple of NBA plays say that went 1-1, and it seemed like it was going to be 1-1, but the other way. I wasn't actually watching the games, but I just looked at the the game recaps and the game flow charts to just try to figure it out. My Celtics won. I went against them. The Knicks made like a big comeback and took the lead. It looks like in the fourth quarter, and they had the lead with like a few minutes left in the game. Wound up losing and failing to cover on my number 3.5 by a half point, losing by 4. And I think the line was 4 at some spots around tip-off time. So could have gotten the best number there and pushed potentially. So gotta love that, obviously. You missed by a half point. You could have had that like half point if you just timed it a little bit better. I think the Knicks probably should have won that game. It looks like it came down to just field goal percentage and free throw percentage, and the Knicks were just way worse in both and had just like a 50% free throw percentage, which is just almost unheard of. It's just awful. And the field goal percentage was below 40%, and the Celtics, especially my guy here, Jason Tatum, had like a really good shooting performance, a much higher field goal percentage. That was the difference in the game, those two things. What can you do, really? I think the Knicks maybe could have pulled out that win. Maybe they should have. The other game was completely different, where I think I got completely lucky, even though I liked the handicap on the Pistons, which I said I wasn't totally sure if I was going to play it, but I did, at least luckily, I guess. But now I'm kind of angry that they didn't get the money line at the end, but they were losing the entire game, and they somehow wound up losing by 1, so it makes it look like they almost could have won the game, and they actually technically could have, but they were down. Detroit was down like almost 20 with like 7 minutes left in the game or something, and they somehow made a furious comeback, and I think Miami just took their foot off the gas completely and just thought the game was over, and Detroit came all the way back and not only covered, but they got within 1 by the end of it, and actually I think had a chance to somehow to win that game somehow, which is just completely insane. But at least I wound up getting away with it, and they did cover. But I think I'd have to look again. I think Detroit had like a ton of turnovers in that game. There was like a huge turnover discrepancy in that game, like 17-7 or something, which had a lot to do with the difference in that game, because I think the other stats were not that lopsided in the game otherwise. So what can you do? I don't know. I liked the way that I handicapped both of those games, at least. Who knows? Let's talk about college football, of course. 4-0 last week. Had a really nice week on this show. The 4-0 college football. You always enjoy that, man. It was a 6-0 day for me with UFC and one NHL play thrown on that. Gotta love that. And since then, I haven't done that well. I had a 1-3 NFL Sunday or whatever. I think I might have been 1-4 on Sunday even. So that's really bad. And then losing almost all of it back. And then I've been not treading water, but slightly losing, because I've been like 2-2 during the week since then. So we got to pick it up. We got to pick up the pace. I think I like these college football plays. I mean, of course I do, because I'm on them. So obviously, if I didn't like them, I would not be on them. And I might have there are a lot of situations this week where I'm like, I want to look to go against this particular team or this particular team. And then there were just things about their opponent and just kind of kept me off of them this week. A lot of situations like that this week. And I can talk about those, because I still do have those leans in those games against the team that I think is in the worst situation out of those two, because I like to go against teams that I think are in bad spots. It's kind of the name of the game. And unfortunately, there are too many matchups this week where I think both teams are kind of in a negative position, although one is more negative than the other. So I might have a lot to break down here. I might talk about all of those briefly, but all of these games are on Saturday. Excuse me. Oh, sorry for my indigestion, man. I got to stop eating like a motherfucker. I don't even think my diet is that bad, really. I mean, I had Asian food, and it's just like I haven't had heartburn like this since I lost weight, like for years. You don't want to hear about that. You want to hear about sandwiches and not the ones that I eat. And I do have, I think, 2 games on this list of my qualified sandwiches, including maybe this one right here. The first game I'm going to talk about is going to be North Carolina State plus 10. NC State. And that's going to be a college afternoon game. What do we got going on here? Is it under NC State? Yeah, it is. So NC State is hosting Clemson. And here it looks like I don't like the cash versus money discrepancy here. And it's so lopsided that I actually don't even think that it might not even change. I don't like that, but I'm really just rolling with the situation here. Unfortunately, it does say 80% of the money is on Clemson, even though it looks like 51% of the tickets are on NC State. I'm not sure I totally buy that because I don't know, after what we've seen recently from NC State especially, I don't know what like public bettor is really going to want to be on them. And I also don't see how 80% of the money, maybe it's just really early, could be on Clemson here if the line is actually dropped from 10.5 to 10, although I don't know when this 10.5 is actually posted because sometimes these opening numbers on pregame go back like a week or even further, so it's hard to tell like if that movement has actually happened, but you just got to eye like what the movement has been during the week, although this game I kind of haven't really. But what do we got going on in this Clemson-NC State game here, and why am I on NC State? There are a few reasons, and they're going to be similar. A few of my games this week have similar situations here where I think it's a bad spot for one team and a pretty positive spot for the other team. Clemson, I think they're not in a good spot, and I think it kind of qualifies as a sandwich spot. So first of all, they haven't really been great this year. For a Clemson team especially, Clemson is a team that they're that known quantity, that big name. Everybody expects them to be high in the rankings. I believe they're fairly high in the rankings to start the season. They started right out by looking like maybe they're not as good as we think they are and really got manhandled by Duke in that first game. And it seems like every time they step up in class, they just haven't been able to quite do it, even though the Florida State game was much more competitive. The Miami game was competitive last week, but Miami, we know about Miami underperforming their talent level under Mario Cristobal. I don't know how many times I have to talk about that. He's a terrible coach, and it just continues to happen where Miami tends to perform worse than they really should given their talent level. But Clemson, they got a lot going on here. So first I will say, because that Miami game dealt them their third loss, I think we can say Clemson is absolutely done at this point. Like, they had really high aspirations. They always do. They're Clemson. They still have Dabo Swinney there. They're a known team, that name team. They always have basically championship aspirations, or at least playoff aspirations to start the season. And even with 2 losses, I think you could say they kind of thought maybe we're still in the mix here. Even though they had lost to Florida State, and Florida State continues to be undefeated, so it would be difficult for them to compete for the ACC, really, but they could still get into, I believe the ACC still has a championship game between the top 2 teams there, so they still had a shot at being one of those top 2 teams for sure, with Louisville and North Carolina. Not really teams that I think are like insurmountably good near the top of the conference there. But now Clemson has that third loss. I think that loss, that could be like a dream crusher scenario for Clemson, man. You come off that third loss like that, and now you really know, like, it starts to sink in, I think. Our season aspirations, they're over. Like, you might consider the season to be over. It's not to say that Clemson is just going to be unmotivated completely for the rest of the season, but that's a crushing blow, and the way that it happened was even crazier. It was against Miami, who they're a team with a good record still. They were ranked at some points during the season. I think they're still a big name. The game was competitive, like basically all the way through. Clemson had the lead at various points, including in the fourth quarter. They gave up a tying field goal very late in the game with 1:51 left and sent it into overtime. The game went 2 overtimes, so they finally gave up the game-winning touchdown to Miami, and that's a really tough way to lose. So they're coming off a 2 overtime game against a Miami team that's still like a name team. That is a big game that dealt them their third loss. So now they might be a little bit unfocused here, and they might be in that sort of dream crusher mode here, dream crusher scenario, realizing we absolutely are not going to achieve what we wanted to here. We can't contend for the ACC title now. They have to play a second straight road game, go to NC State, and deal with that. And up next, they have Notre Dame, another ranked team up next week, which is a much bigger game. So they might have one eye ahead there. And I think that makes this qualify as a sandwich spot. Sandwich between Miami and Notre Dame, though you might argue that Miami isn't like the greatest team. But even so, I think this NC State game, this is like a spot where they could overlook NC State somewhat easily here. And on the other side, NC State, I think they're in a good spot, whereas I think Clemson is in a really horrendous spot. NC State, what did we see last from them? This was 2 weeks ago. They played Duke, and that was a game I unfortunately was on. I thought it was a bad spot for Duke. I thought NC State would come to play there and show up after they had that struggle against Marshall. But that was not to be. And they had a really bad game where they almost got blanked by Duke, even though Duke does have a good defense. But after that, they get a bye. So I think that is a good it's a good situation for a bye to come up for NC State. You have that pretty ugly loss, even though it was to a good team. You get to have that bye, you get that extra rest, extra week to prepare, and you have that big-name team of Clemson coming into your house, man. You're coming back home. You're going to be focused on that Clemson team, I would have to imagine. And Clemson is laying, I think, probably some extra lumber, some extra wood on the road here because they are Clemson, because they have that name recognition. And I think the way NC State has looked recently, I think there's going to be some recency bias here because they looked so bad against Duke. I think that affects the line, might give them a little bit of a larger line here to deal with. They're getting 10 points on the road in this game, man. 10 points on the road, a lot of points to be laying for a Clemson team that's in such a bad spot. NC State with an extra week to prepare, and the over-under, the total's only 44, which is pretty low, especially for college. So I don't know what the movement has been on. It looks like it's actually gone up a little bit from 43.5, but even so, 44 is a short total to see in college football, so that just means that those points are going to be extra value there. All of it is going to line me up on NC State, man. Plus the 10, that's the first play. I like NC State, plus the points. It's a good situation for them and a horrific one for Clemson, in my opinion. Let's do it. NC State, baby. That's I have no games in the noon slate here. That's a 3:30 game, 3:30 slate, and I think the next game is also in the afternoon at 3:30 or at 4, I forget, but it's going to be Louisville -4. Speaking of NC State's last game against Duke, I'm going to be fading Duke this time, and it's going to be with Louisville -4. It's another 3:30 p.m. game here, and you can see here, this game, it does look like the market is indicating on the side that I'm on here, where Duke has 58% of the tickets on them, but 63% of the money looks like it's on Louisville, and it looks like it's pushed Louisville up from the 4 to a 4 with extra juice there, and it might be headed to 4.5. I'm in on the 4. I think the 4s are still out there, but it looks like there is market movement for me, reverse line movement, if you want to call it that, against where the majority of the tickets are, but this is telling me that it looks like some of the bigger money, the smarter money, is playing Louisville here. And why might that be the case? I think Duke, first of all, even though they have the slightly worse record here, I think, Duke, I'll talk about the situation in a minute and why I think the money is on Louisville. But Duke, I think we might get a little bit of extra value in the number here because I think people are going to look and, first of all, say, well, this is ranked, these teams are ranked 18 and 20 here. It's 18 versus 20. People consider that to be kind of just a wash. Like, these teams are basically even almost. I think Duke, because they have the more name recognition, even though that does tend to be in basketball more so than football, I don't think Louisville really gets that much name recognition in football necessarily either. So I think Duke might be the slightly more popular team just because they get that name recognition, even though they actually are the better defensive team than offensive team, I would say, in this matchup. And public does like offense, but I think they don't necessarily know the specifics about these two teams. So I think Duke, just because they are Duke, they might be getting that like bit of like name recognition there. So there might be a little bit of extra value on Louisville because of that, but also because it's number 18 versus number 20, people consider that to be kind of an even game, like a competitive matchup. People are going to tend to want to play the underdog, the recreational bettors, thinking there's value there. They're going to want to take those extra points, take the 4, or play like Duke on the money line or whatever it might be, because you might be getting like, you're only going to be laying 100 to win like 190 or something like that in that range, instead of having to lay like a favorite price, which is what you would have to do on Louisville. So that's the way that I think the recreational bettors are going to bet. I am not going to be doing that. So not only do I think there's slight value on Louisville, I think Louisville is the better team. The line is telling you they're the better team because they're getting more than home field advantage with the 4, but I think they're a little bit more of the better team than that would indicate there. So I think it should be maybe pushed up even a little bit slightly. What did we see from these two teams? Duke, they played a tough game in their last game, man. So this is going to be their second straight road game. It's not going to be a sandwich in this case, but they got back-to-back road games against good teams, which is a tough situation to be in. I don't think they're going to be unfocused for a Louisville team because Louisville is one of the top teams in the ACC here, so it is a battle. So I wouldn't say that, but Duke coming off this game against Florida State. This was like Duke's biggest opponent on the season. They're facing a top 4 ranked team in Florida State, the team that's leading the conference, a team that's undefeated. And if you look at what happened in this game, Duke was leading that game into the fourth quarter. They were winning by 10 in the second quarter. They were winning by 3 still going into the fourth, and then Florida State, it almost looks like they just completely ran away with it at the end there. But they did score like a few touchdowns in a row there, 3 straight touchdowns. But that was a close game. Duke was playing in that game, and they pretty much came to play. They give a full effort. They were in that game into the fourth quarter. And coming off that, I think it might be a little bit tough to get back up off the mat, even if you are facing a team that is a named team that's, not necessarily a named team, but a ranked team, a team that's good like Louisville. It's going to be tough. Second straight road game, and you put in so much effort in that Florida State game. But more than that, so I think Duke might be in a little bit of a tough spot there because of that. A bit of a tough spot. On the other side, you have Louisville with an extra week off. So I think this helps Louisville quite a bit. So what we see here is they were kind of rolling along, and then you remember I was on Pitt against Louisville the last time we saw Louisville, and Pitt, who wasn't really doing anything. Pitt was just an ugly team. They still are, really. I don't think their offense is that good, even still. Nobody expected what happened in that game, although I was on Pitt plus the 8 because I thought it was a bad spot for Louisville. Louisville had come off their legitimizing game, basically their huge win against Notre Dame. Big win, their biggest opponent of the season. That's the win that vaulted them up into the rankings, legitimized them in the eye of the viewer. They were coming off that. This was a major letdown spot and a sandwich spot, really, after that, because even though they had a bye in there, they had this Duke game upcoming. So this is a much better spot for Louisville. So Louisville was in a bad spot against Pittsburgh. That was a sandwich spot, coming off that monster win and then having this bigger game up next. So they just struggled against Pitt. They didn't show up, and I think that is going to, they showed up for half the game at least. They were winning the game, I think 21-17, and then Pitt wound up totally running away with it in the end, 38-21 after that 21 straight points in the later part of that game. But it looks ugly to people. People are going to look at that and not really want to have anything to do with Louisville because of that. That just looked really ugly. But now Louisville they went into a bye on an ugly note, which I think that's what you want the bye for. Just like I was talking about with NC State, you go in, and I think I'm all 4 of these plays. I think this is going to be the case. I'm playing on teams that are coming out of byes. You go into that bye on an ugly note. I think you use that bye to your advantage. Whereas if you went into it on a good note, I think it's kind of a momentum stopper. But if you go into that onto a bad note, like that Pittsburgh game was the momentum stopper, then you get the bye. So then you're going to use that bye to refocus. You have an extra week to prepare for this big game that's upcoming against Duke. Duke does not have that advantage of having that extra week. And in fact, while Louisville was on that bye resting, Duke had to play that huge game against Florida State, and we're in that game to the fourth quarter. So I think this is a bad spot for Duke. I think there might be a little bit of value as well on Louisville because of the perception of these two teams. I think is maybe a little bit closer than what the reality might be. I like Louisville here. Louisville minus the 4. That's my next play there. Continuing on, I believe, still Saturday afternoon, Cal plus 10.5. And this is going to be another game that I believe I consider to be a sandwich. We got California. This is 4 p.m. on Saturday. And it looks like it's actually at 11. You might be able to grab the 11. Not much of a difference between 10.5 and 11 because 10 is kind of the more key number there. But looking at this, I like what I'm seeing from the market here as well. This is against USC. And, of course, USC, you know them. They're a big-name team. They're, of course, going to draw a lot of the a lot of the public action. Big teams, 69% of the tickets are on USC. 56% of the money, however, looks like it's on the other side, on Cal. So just kind of like what I was saying with kind of what we're seeing with this market analysis, market overview with that Duke-Louisville game. This looks like another, it might be pros versus Joes, scenario here where the public is, of course, going to be on USC against Cal. They know USC is the better team, but obviously the books are telling you they're the better team. USC is laying a lot of points on the road here, man. And why do I think there's extra value here? Not just because of the name alone, USC is going to get like a little bit of extra juice on that number there. Just in the USC name alone, I think it's going to be hard to find value on USC in most spots like this, especially in a spot where they're playing a team that doesn't really carry name recognition like that. But what puts this way over the top is the situation that we're in here. So USC has actually slipped to the 24th ranking after they started out a much higher ranked team. And I think we all know this is because USC, their defense sucks. I don't know what else to say about that. USC came into the season, man, and this is what I'm going to talk about. Like what I talked about with Clemson, I think USC is now in a dream crusher scenario. USC came into the season, man. They came in. They have their quarterback, I believe, is supposed to be like he's the Heisman favorite, I believe. They come into the season. They have very high aspirations. They're ranked really high, thinking, hey, we're going to vie for the Pac-12, and then we're going to be vying for one of those coveted playoff spots, and we're going to be vying for the national championship. We're USC, big name. Those are their season aspirations, and now that they have 2 losses, I think that kind of ends those hopes. It doesn't really end their hopes of winning the Pac-12, I wouldn't say, even though they do have Washington to contend with here. But I think that a 2-loss team is kind of unlikely to make that 4-team playoff field, especially, I don't know if how bad USC's defense is might wind up getting factored into that as well. But I think it's going to be tough for them to get into the playoffs now. And they're coming off the other reason why I really think they're in a horrible spot here is this is a massive sandwich, man. They're coming off 2 big games against Notre Dame and Utah. And then after this Cal game, which is the one down spot left in their schedule, they have all up games after that, too, against Washington and then Oregon, the top 2 ranked teams in the conference, 2 monster games there, and then UCLA to finish the season. I don't know how they're going to get up for a Cal team on the road here. It's going to be very, very tough for USC. It's a very tough ask of USC to do that. And what happened with USC last week? They played a pretty big game, major game against Utah. And I don't know if it was going into this game or if it's going into this upcoming game, but Utah, I think it's actually after this game, they finally were able to finalize the fact that their injured starting quarterback is not coming back for Utah. So they finally know that their injured quarterback, who would be their starting quarterback otherwise, is finally officially being shut down for the season. I don't know if that matters that much. It might help Utah kind of just put that to bed and get that out of mind. It might just solidify them a little bit more, knowing, yes, this is our guy. There's no question about it. We're going with this guy now, our starting quarterback. There's no hope that he's coming back, because with him being injured and the possibility of him coming back, that could still kind of be in the back of your mind and maybe affect you a little bit. But Utah, whatever. I mean, that might affect them in this upcoming game. It might give them a little bit. It might solidify Utah a little bit in their upcoming game, even though, as I'll talk about, I actually don't necessarily like Utah that much in their upcoming game this week. I can talk about that game in a little bit when I talk about some games that I'm not actually on. But back to this USC game. Keep going on tangents, baby. It's going to be a long night, long videos. I don't shut up. My autism. Utah, they're a highly ranked team. What did they do in this game against USC? This was a game that was a bit back and forth, competitive game, close game. Utah wound up having the late lead. They actually gave the lead up late to USC. USC failed on a 2-point conversion where they were trying to push the lead to 3 there after they retook it by 1 near the end. Could have pushed it to 3 with 1:46 left in the game. That was not to be, and Utah wound up getting into field goal range and kicking a field goal on the very last play of the game to win and basically seal USC's fate, man. And that is a really, really difficult way to lose for USC. And they're taking their second loss, because the week before this, they took a loss to Notre Dame, which maybe was a little bit of a tough position. I talked about that game a little bit and didn't really know what I thought of it. It is kind of a tough position for like a non-physical, like finesse West Coast team like USC to have to go into Notre Dame like that, where Notre Dame is a much more like defensive-oriented team. And I think that's kind of what happened in that game. USC's defense is just terrible, as it has been all season, and Notre Dame just knocked them around. I think maybe Notre Dame was just too physical for them as well. So they came off that big game. That was their first loss, a loss against a highly ranked Notre Dame team. Then they had to come back home and play this game against Utah. They went all out in this game. They actually made a big comeback, because Utah actually had taken an 11-point lead going into the fourth after USC had led earlier in the game. And they wound up just losing it on literally the last play of the game, right at the end, after a failed 2-point conversion that would have at least made it so that if Utah kicked a field goal at the end, it would have been a tying field goal instead of a winning field goal. Very tough way to lose. And Utah did actually outplay USC in the game. You can see yardage-wise, they outgained them by 81 yards. They out first down them by 5. They outpossessed them pretty significantly by 9 minutes or so there, more than 9 minutes. Utah outplayed USC there. So now USC, like I said, they're coming off that game, and this is just a sandwich, man. It's not only a hangover spot and a dream crusher spot, most likely, because I think that second loss is really going to just eliminate their playoff hopes. They have Cal on the road, who they might not be paying much attention to at all, and then Washington up next, followed by Oregon and UCLA. Major sandwich. This is a huge, huge, meaty sandwich, baby, and the kind that I like. It's I'm from the Boston area, the North Shore, roast beef three-way, baby. You got this three-way in here with Utah, Washington, and Oregon. The roast beef three-way. It's got barbecue sauce, mayo, and provolone cheese on that baby. It's piled high. That's what we got here, man, even though this is more of a Pacific Coast sandwich of some kind. I don't even know what kind of sandwiches they eat out there. They're bitches. They don't really eat anything substantial out there. They eat sushi and other garbage. I don't care. Whatever. It's a huge sandwich here. And what do we have on the other side for Cal? I like the spot that Cal is in as well. And not only just because they're actually 3-4 right now, which when a team is one game below 500, that tends to be a little bit of a motivator in some ways, where you want to get back to that 500. And then at that point, you're kind of still playing to be like bowl eligible if you're Cal. You still have that possibility out there. But what position is Cal in? And you see Cal, they did just get destroyed by Utah in their last game. And people might look at that and think, hey, Cal got annihilated by Utah. USC just lost right at the end to Utah in a much more competitive game. So people might do that like syllogistic thing that I talk about, where they'll look at how Team A and Team B both did against Team C and think that that means something. But in individual situations, it doesn't really. Even though USC is just, they are obviously the better team, but in a situation like this, it's just a much, much worse situation for USC for all those reasons that I just specified. So I think the value is only going to be found on Cal here. But Cal, looking at their schedule, so yeah, they got blown out by Utah. Okay, I mean, can't really fault them for that, really. I did think Utah was in a bad spot in that game, though. I think, if I remember correctly, I think I talked about that briefly. But needless to say, though, Cal did not really do that well in that game. But now what do they have? I think in all 4 of my games this week, man, my team that I'm playing is coming out of a bye, and they went into a bye on kind of an ugly note, even though these are 2 good teams. So you can't really fault them for losing to Oregon State, which was fairly competitive. And I think I was on Cal in that game, like bet. I think I actually had a bet on them in that game, and they missed by like a couple points covering that one. Oregon State not in a really good spot there. But still, you can't really fault Cal for losing to 2 good teams like Oregon State and Utah. And their other they have this other loss on the season to Washington, which was also like somewhat competitive. And Auburn even isn't really that bad a team, and that was a competitive game too. So they really have had a difficult schedule. So I think Cal might be undervalued in that they look worse than they actually are too, because like all their losses are to pretty good teams. But they have a really difficult schedule, so they might be a little bit undervalued in that manner too. But now they're coming out of a bye, which they went into on 2 losses, kind of ugly losses. They get that extra week to refocus, or prepare for this upcoming game. Just like I said with those other games, they're going to be focused on USC, man. And not only because USC is a big name team, as they always are, but also this is like a little brother, big brother in-state scenario where USC has certainly had the upper hand for almost ever, probably, I would say, in football over Cal. Cal, like, they're typically going to step it up when they play an in-state big brother like USC here. They're going to want to give it their all and look good against USC. So even though they do have Oregon up next, of course, coming out of a bye and having all that time to focus and prepare for this, I think Cal's got to be focused on this, on their bigger brother as well from California. I like it. I like Cal quite a bit. It's a meaty sandwich, a very big, monstrous sandwich. Basically a fucking Dagwood sandwich piled to the sky, piled massively on Cal. Take Cal plus the points, plus the 10.5. And with Cal and with NC State taking them as like double-digit home underdogs here, I put like a little bit on the money line. Once it gets to like a double-digit dog, I might shift. When it's lower than a double-digit dog, I tend to put like 10% of the bet on the money line. So if they win outright, I can get that like little extra there, because I do think there's just generally value on that team. So there should be value in them on the money line as well, for the most part as well, generally speaking. When it gets into double digits, I kind of shift that a little bit, and I might make the money line sprinkle be more like 3% of the bet. But what have you, whatever. Do what you want with that. But yeah, I like Cal plus 10.5. To finish it out, my fourth and final actual play I'm going to be talking about is going to be on Kentucky plus 4. And this is, all of these situations are actually quite similar this week, where we have a team coming off a pretty big game against a team coming off a bye. So I like that quite a bit. What do we got going on here? This is a similar situation in that Tennessee is the team that's going to carry more name recognition here as well, in the Tennessee-Kentucky rivalry, and Tennessee's had the upper hand over them too, which I think everybody knows. Everybody knows that Tennessee is the better team. The line's telling you they're the better team. They're a 3.5-point favorite, whatever. We know that that's the case. They've had the upper hand in this rivalry, but I think that gives Kentucky a little bit of extra motivation there, because they've had to play like second fiddle to Tennessee in this rivalry for the most part for a while. Kentucky might step up their game a little bit. But before I talk about the situation, the market here, Tennessee's got 56% of the tickets on them. They are definitely the more public team, and I'm assuming they're the higher-ranked team still. They must be. They're the team that's going to carry more of the public perception. But Kentucky looks like they might have 60% of the money on them here. Although it looks like the line for Tennessee may have gone up from 3.5 to 3.5 with some juice. I don't know about that. I do think that the market read is kind of a pros versus Joes type of appearance here, at least to me, looking at what I see in the market here, even though I won't put that much stock into that tick up on the Tennessee spread there, really. I think that Kentucky, situationally, I think it makes sense that they're the right side here, and I think it makes sense that they would be getting more of the pros on them, where more of the Joes might be on Tennessee, the more public, the more recreational bettors there. And what do we got here? Well, I kind of alluded to it. Yeah, Kentucky actually has fallen out of the rankings completely. So there's only going to be value. And one more thing I will say about the market, the number there. So there is going to be that perception on Tennessee. The perception is they're the better team, which they are, of course. But I don't think that they're as much the better team as it appears that they are. Tennessee, of course, they're going to carry that like little bit of extra perception as well, now that not only are they Tennessee and they have that big name, but they are ranked, and Kentucky is no longer ranked. So the public bettors like to look at how the teams are ranked too. And of course, I like to kind of go the opposite way. When you see these AP polls, the AP polls don't really they're not a good indicator at all, really, of how good teams really are. The Vegas odds, the bookmakers, the people that actually are taking huge bets and have like tons of money at stake, they're more trustworthy on that, on which team is better than the other team, than the AP polls are. So I like to look at discrepancies as far as that's concerned as well. And that leads me to saying, it's a long-winded way of saying that I think Tennessee, this number might be kind of a trap here, where it almost looks too easy to lay the points with Tennessee here, where they're only laying 3.5, just like a little bit more than a field goal here. it almost looks too easy to jump in on Tennessee here, in my opinion. And especially with what we've seen recently from these teams, it's all kind of perception here, where people would see that Tennessee, like, they've played much more like competitively. Maybe, well, Kentucky started out really good, but just the recency bias, I think, is going to play in. And people saw last week, what did they see from Tennessee? They put up a pretty competitive game against Alabama, and the final score actually isn't really indicative of how that game went. Tennessee was rolling early, and they went into the half actually winning 20-7. Then they let that lead kind of slip. They were still in the game pretty deep into the game, into the fourth quarter. They were only down a score still in the fourth quarter, and then they wound up giving up a fumble 6 so sort of towards the end here that made the Alabama victory look stronger than it actually was. You can see here Tennessee actually kind of outplayed them in some ways. They had more yards, more first downs. They didn't win the time possession battle, but one fewer turnover as well. So you could argue that Tennessee possibly could have and maybe should have won that game. There is an argument to be had for that. But either way, it's going to do two things. It's going to play into the public perception where people are going to see, hey, Tennessee, they're a ranked team. They played a tough game against Alabama. Played Alabama pretty well. We know that they're a good team. Alabama's a very good team. Tennessee's a good team. Played that game close. They were in striking distance. They were winning, and then they were still within striking distance until late in that game. But also, that's a tough game for Tennessee to come off of, man. It's a big game for Tennessee. And now Tennessee comes off of that game, that huge game. Now they have to play Kentucky, even though this is kind of a rivalry game. I think maybe it is technically a rivalry game. And they don't really have anything up next. They have UConn, so it's not really a sandwich or anything. But I think it might kind of be a letdown spot here. And that was kind of maybe a momentum stopper to some extent, where Tennessee was rolling a little bit. They were on that nice win streak there, 3 wins in a row, and they ran into Alabama, a real step-up game for them. Had to play that. This is kind of similar to, I think, the situation that I was talking about with Duke, maybe, where they kind of ran into a really good team and just lost the game, and then and now they have a second straight road game to have to contend with, which is a tough situation when you're coming off a game where you put in like a max effort. You played a really tough game, big game. Now you have to turn around and play a second game on the road here in a hostile environment. That is a tough situation to be in. On the other side, Kentucky, I think Kentucky, like I said, man, with all of the teams that I'm playing this week, Kentucky, on the other hand, is in a much better spot, just like the other 3 teams. They're coming out of a bye, baby, just like these other teams. And what did they do going into the bye? Well, they were rolling along. They were an undefeated team, 5-0, until they ran into Georgia, number 1 Georgia, coming off that nice Florida win. Georgia blew the doors off them, man. Georgia is just clearly the much better team. I talked about that back then. I thought Georgia would be able to handle them, but even I didn't expect it to be that much of a Georgia blowout. But once you run into that, it could go like one of 2 ways. Like, you could say that maybe that team will be embarrassed and they'll bounce back and be focused, but you could also say that they really were given like a kind of a crushing defeat in a way that kind of like sends them back to reality, and that might still be like down on themselves. I don't know what a better way to phrase that is, but it's kind of like a loss where they might get sent crashing back down to earth, and they might just kind of be hung over a little bit coming into that next game. That may have been the case here, because if I recall correctly, this game was tough for me to read when Kentucky played Missouri. Missouri was coming off that tough loss that I don't like to keep bringing up against LSU, where Missouri was winning the game with like a few minutes left in the game. They let the lead go away, had one more chance at it. We're still going to cover the game. And they threw a pick 6, which was like the only way that they weren't going to cover at that point. Brutal. So I thought Missouri, coming off that tough loss to LSU, where they had chances to win that game and played LSU really tough. I thought Missouri was in a tough spot against Kentucky, but Kentucky was in that situation where they were sent crashing down to earth by Georgia. So maybe both teams were just in a bad spot there. Kentucky lost to Missouri. Wasn't a great performance out of them. But now, after those 2 losses, they go into the bye. And like I said, going into the bye on a bad note like that, on the losing note, and you have a big-name team upcoming in Tennessee like this, you're going to spend that bye. It's going to help you like refocus, help you get over those losses. You're going to change your schemes, maybe change what you're doing. You're going to be, you have that extra week. You're going to come prepared for this bigger game that you have going on against Tennessee. Just like I said with all the other plays that I have this week, they're all teams coming out of byes, man, and I like it. I like it quite a bit. Tennessee's in that tough spot coming off that hard-fought Alabama game. The perception, I think, is that Tennessee is maybe a little bit more the better team than they actually are in a spot like this. Kentucky has spent like the last several years being the worst of these two teams in this rivalry, so I think they're going to want to put in a good effort here and want to show up. Kentucky, I said it was 3.5, which it is on the board here, but I found a stray +4 on Kentucky, so I took it. So that's my play, Kentucky +4. I would still be on them at 3.5. I don't think there's that much of a difference there. I like it. I like Kentucky. So hopefully not let this go too much longer. My 4 actual plays, I like them all. 4 teams that are all coming off byes against teams that I think are in much more difficult spots, who played tough games last week and are coming into this game in a much tougher spot. We got North Carolina State as a home underdog +10 against Clemson. That's a sandwich spot for Clemson as well. Louisville -4 against Duke. Cal +10.5 at home. The nice big meaty home dog there again against USC. That's also a sandwich spot that USC is in. I think a monster sandwich, if I have to say so myself. Eat up those sandwiches, baby. And Kentucky +4, which I believe is yet another home underdog. So 4 home teams and 3 home underdogs, and those are the 4 plays. And we can go over like a little bit more of what's going on this week. If I can run down this card a little bit, there were a lot of, like I said, a lot of spots here where I was like, I might want to go against this particular team, but maybe not. I can talk about like leans, maybe try to do this more quickly than actually looking at like the cash tickets discrepancy, although maybe I'll mention it. Minnesota is -7 against Michigan State. It looks like they got 67% of the tickets, but 82% of the cash is on Michigan State, even though it looks like Minnesota might have ticked up a little bit. I like Michigan State +7. That would be the way I would lean in this one. Looks like it might be another kind of pros versus Joes where nobody wants anything to do with Michigan State, how ugly and how much of a mess they've looked like most of this year, but they have been competitive in some games as an underdog. Minnesota cannot score, really, and this is a game with a low total at 40. Minnesota's coming off a nice upset of Iowa, a very low-scoring game, 12-10, just ugliness. Minnesota cannot really score, which is also, like I said, that's another reason why I don't really have confidence in them to cover like a big number as a big favorite like this. But that win over Iowa was pretty good as well. They won as a dog. Nice win over Iowa. Michigan State, on the other hand, I think they played Michigan, which, yeah, it's a rivalry game. You could consider that to be like a game that Michigan State will show up for a lot of times. But Michigan State just got totally embarrassed in that game. I think they lost 49-0. I would only look to Michigan State in this one. They're the embarrassed commodity here. The embarrassed team. Minnesota's coming off a nice upset win. It was over a ranked Iowa team, even though I think it was a small upset of like 3.5 points or something. Iowa was ranked at least, so Minnesota might be feeling a little bit high off of that win, and they know how ugly Michigan State has looked. I would only look to Michigan State in that one. Virginia, Miami. I lean to Miami in this one, but this is a game where I really wanted to go against Virginia, man, because what did Virginia do next week? What did Virginia do last week? They upset North Carolina, and I believe it was in North Carolina, dealing North Carolina their first loss. Just crazy that North Carolina lost that game outright. I don't know the specifics really of how that game played out necessarily, but Virginia was able to win that game as a 24-point underdog. And now I believe this is a second straight game on the road for them, which is a bad spot to be in for Virginia. Back-to-back tough road games and coming off a monster upset, like win of the season. I think they were celebrating that game there against UNC there. That was a big win, although UNC, their defense is not the best. Last year it was worse than it is this year, but it's not really the greatest. But, man, it's going to be tough for Virginia to come to play again here after such a monster effort. They're in a letdown spot, in my opinion. A couple of things make me question it, which is why I haven't actually played Miami here, even though Miami looks like they've ticked up from 18 to 18.5. One thing is that it's a big line, 18.5. I'd have to lay 18.5 in a game with a total has gone down to 46.5. That's tough. It's a lot of points to be laying in a game with a low total like that, where the points might have like a little bit more value attached to each point there. It might be tough to score for both teams in this game is kind of what that's indicating. So that makes it tough. Does look like Miami has 95% of the cash though, but only 76% of tickets. So it does look like the money is kind of on Miami, and it might be for the reasons I talked about. Virginia is in such a tough spot, but not only the fact that it's like a huge line here is kind of what's keeping me off of this, where it's going to be tough for Miami to cover such a huge spread with a game with a low total like this. But Miami, it's going to be tough to find value on Miami in really many spots because they are like the better named team. Although maybe that's contradicted in this game because everybody knows Virginia. They saw Virginia play really well against North Carolina, and Miami hasn't looked that great. They've struggled. Like I said, they had that disgustingly unacceptable loss to Georgia Tech where they could have just kneeled and won the game, and they fumbled it over and then gave up a touchdown. They literally had the game sealed if they just kneeled, sealed if they just knelt, sealed if they just kneeled. Let's make it sound more poetic. Yeah. So the public might be a little bit less high on Miami because of all the mistakes that they've been making. But what they saw last from Miami, though, is that, and this is what is kind of the clinching thing. It's kind of keeping me off of it, even though I do lean Miami here because Virginia is just in such a bad spot off of such a monster win. But Miami, they're kind of coming off like a pretty big win of their own, which I talked about in that Clemson analysis. That was the game against Clemson. It's a big game whenever you face a big-name team like Clemson, and Miami bounce back from those really disgustingly ugly losses and mistakes that they've been making. They won that game, and it went double overtime, and they have to come off that double overtime game. So I think both of these teams are in a bad spot. So I don't really want to play Miami when they're in a spot like that, but Virginia, I think, is still in the worst spot there. But it was a situation where I'm like, as soon as Virginia pulled off that massive upset, I tend to want to I'm like, who are they playing next week? I want to go against that team. But then it's like, crap, they're playing Miami, who isn't in like the best spot necessarily. So those are my feelings on that. The lean would still be to Miami, though, just because Virginia's in such a horrific spot. West Virginia, Central Florida. I tend to lean with West Virginia here to some extent. Central Florida's got 53% of the tickets on them, but it looks like 68% of the cash is on West Virginia. Both of these teams have kind of played ugly. Like Central Florida had some ugly games like a couple weeks ago. They just as I mentioned, like a couple of weeks ago and last week, the professional bettors were on Central Florida at Kansas, thinking that they were going to play a nice competitive game there, and they just got absolutely destroyed in Kansas. I don't know what that was really. So, but it's interesting that the public is like slightly on Central Florida here, 53% of the tickets on them, but 68% of the cash on West Virginia. And it looks like the line has ticked up from Central Florida 6.5 to 7. I don't know what that's about because it does look like more of the money and maybe the professional money is actually on West Virginia, which is the way that I lean here. So I don't know if I'd put much stock into the number ticking up, other than you get more value if you want to take West Virginia. Take the +7 if you want to do that. But Central Florida, they're coming off a big game. They played Oklahoma. Central Florida's new to the Big 12. I think Central Florida, Houston, Cincinnati, and maybe one other team are all new to the Big 12 this year. That was a big game for Central Florida. And Central Florida, I believe, was winning that game pretty late in the game, and they wound up falling like right at the end in a close loss. I think they lost by 2 in the end of it to Oklahoma. But Oklahoma, I think I mentioned it last week that I leaned Central Florida on that one because Oklahoma was coming off they were in a bad spot because they were coming out of a bye, which they went into off of that huge win in the Red River rivalry over Texas. So going into a bye on such a high, coming out of that bye, I thought Oklahoma was in a bad spot. So that might make Central Florida's competitive game against Oklahoma look a little bit less good there. Central Florida, I think, is in a play against spot because they showed up and they had that lead late against a good Oklahoma team, and then they faltered right at the end. It's going to be tough for them to turn around after that and play put in another big effort here, especially when it's against West Virginia, who's been struggling. And that's kind of why I would lean That's another reason why I would lean West Virginia here, and I think there might be some value in taking them here. Nobody is really going to want West Virginia after what they've seen recently. Last week, I thought they were in like a decent spot because they had a little bit extra rest, I think, or maybe both teams were kind of on extra rest there. They were playing against Oklahoma State. I know West Virginia went into last week's game off of that loss to Houston, where it was kind of stripped away from them right at the end. Houston, it was a crazy ending where I think West Virginia let like a multiple score lead or something slip near the end, and Houston somehow was able to find a way to escape that with a win. I thought West Virginia, even though that's a tough way to lose, it was against Houston. It wasn't really that good, and I thought West Virginia might find a way to turn around and play a better game against OK State last week, Oklahoma State. But West Virginia, I think they made too many mistakes in that game, if I recall, and I think that makes West Virginia look a little worse than they are, but they're coming off an ugly performance, ugly loss. So I think the only value here is on West Virginia here. Central Florida's in a bad spot off of that near win, near big upset of Oklahoma. Tough spot for them, and West Virginia's kind of in more of a bounce back spot. So I like West Virginia in that one. What else we got going on here? Looks like Miami, Ohio might be in somewhat of a tough spot. I know they had like that big MAC game against Toledo last week, and Toledo wound up winning that game in a tough competitive game, and it looks like the money is a bit more on Ohio here, 76% of the cash, but only 71% of the money, and it's driven it up to 7, but I think this is also kind of a big brother, little brother scenario here, though, where Miami, Ohio is the little brother, so maybe they will still step it up here, even though they're coming off a big game against Toledo. This is still a big game, I guess, against Ohio, who does have a good record as well. These are both still like kind of top teams in the MAC, really, and Ohio's been like the bigger brother in the state to Miami, Ohio, even though so has Toledo been, really. But so that might keep me away from that, even though Miami, Ohio's coming off that tough game. They might still be able to step it up again in a game like this. I don't know for sure. Indiana against Penn State, I would kind of, even though it looks like Penn State is the market read here because they've gone up from this massive 31.5 point favorite up to a 32-point favorite, 32.5. But it looks like, so they've gone up, and it looks like 79% of the tickets, but only 51% of the cash on Indiana. So it looks like the market is saying Penn State, but I'm not quite sure I buy it. Penn State's coming off a pretty tough loss. They played the big game that everybody was talking about, the big game against Ohio State last week. Coming off that, they might be in a tough spot, and that was their first loss and was a big game. They didn't play quite as competitively as that 8-point final makes it look. They were kind of out of that game. But coming off that, there's no way I would want to lay like a gigantic spread with Penn State here. So I don't get like the market read on that one. I would lean against Penn State. And Indiana had an ugly game against Rutgers, getting absolutely kind of destroyed, 31-14. They were coming off a game against Michigan, although they got embarrassed completely against Michigan. Maybe it was a tough spot for them coming out of the Rutgers game. I would not want to be on Penn State here. There's going to be no value, in my opinion, to be had on Penn State laying a gigantic number. Everybody knows Penn State's the way better team here. Saw them play somewhat decently against Ohio State, I guess you could say. And Indiana's just looked like really, really ugly recently. So I don't get the market read on that. Penn State's kind of in that hangover spot, in my opinion. Indiana might be in more of a bounce back spot. Speaking of the Penn State-Ohio State game, I lean against Ohio State fairly strongly. This is one that I was considering playing against Ohio State because they're in a letdown spot. They're coming off the game I just talked about, the big win over Penn State. That was that hyped big Big Ten matchup, man. Ohio State did it. They were the better team against Penn State. They won fairly decisively, even though the final score looks a little bit less decisive than it kind of really was. I think Ohio State might be in a letdown mode now off of that big win. They have to go to Wisconsin, which is a tough place to play. Looks like Ohio State has gone up, though. Has gone up from 14 to 14.5, though. And it looks like 80% of the cash, but 74% of the tickets on Ohio State. So more of the cash and tickets. I'm not sure if I buy it really at all. This is a lot of points to be laying on the road with an Ohio State team like this. In Wisconsin, even though they've kind of shifted to more of a passing offense, they can still run the ball, and I think that's probably what they're going to try to do in a game like this, to try to shorten the game when they know they're like big underdogs like this and they're at home. Ohio State's coming off that really, really big win. And what Wisconsin did last week, I said that I leaned Illinois in that one, and Illinois probably should have covered, if not won the game outright there. Illinois was up multiple scores, like pretty deep into that game, and just completely imploded late. And Wisconsin somehow was able to not only win but cover at the end by like 1 point as like a 3-point favorite. They won by 4 at the end after they were down like 14 somewhere. I think probably in the second half of that game. That's a little bit wild. I don't know what was going on there. I don't know how Wisconsin pulled that out, but that's kind of an ugly performance from Wisconsin. And when you kind of have an ugly game and you still like you snatch victory from the jaws of defeat there against kind of a lesser opponent like that, that tends to be more of like a performance that might like focus you on the game. And you might say that Wisconsin was like looking ahead to this Ohio State game, which is why I kind of did not like Wisconsin in that game against Illinois last week. So Wisconsin's kind of in the better spot here to refocus. They got the huge name team coming into their house in Ohio State. Ohio State's coming off their big game of the season, biggest game of the season against Penn State. I think it's a letdown spot. The only way I would look there is taking the points at home with Wisconsin. And might be running out of leans to talk about at this point. Is that it? Maybe that is it. Texas, actually one more. Texas played Houston, University of Houston last week. The one other thing I would say is I don't like Houston in this one. They're playing at Kansas State, and Houston, because of their game last week against Texas, that was a big game. Houston was winning that game. I think in the second half of that game, it was a pretty tough, hotly contested game, a big game for Houston as they just joined the Big 12. They're playing their in-state big brother, the biggest brother, basically, in the University of Texas, man. University of Texas at Austin, hook 'em horns, the UT. Big game for Houston to come in as in your first Big 12 season and have to play Texas, and they showed up and they played tough against Texas, and I think they wound up only losing by 7, and that was not really cosmetic either. It was a pretty competitive game, I think, most of the way. Houston was winning that game, like I said, I think fairly deep into the game, wound up succumbing in the end. So after a game like that where you play like such an up game like that, a big game, and you put in a big effort like that, I would only want to look to go against you. They're playing at Kansas State here, which I forget if the Texas game was also on the road. I'm not sure. So this might also be a second straight road game, which would make it worse for Houston. I don't know, but Kansas State does look like they have 69% of the cash and tickets on them. So I don't know what to glean from that, even though it's kind of obviously Kansas State will probably be like the more public team against Houston because people know, of course, that Kansas State is the better team. But here they're laying 17, and it's gone up from 16.5. So I don't know how many of the recreational bettors would really want to lay such a huge number with Kansas State. But so I do like the idea of going against Houston because they had such a tough game against Texas last week, and it's going to be really a rough turnaround to have to turn around from that, get back up off the mat, and play again against Kansas State. But I don't know, because Kansas State's kind of a big-name team in the Big 12 as well, so maybe there's reason for Houston to come focus, even though you got to think, like, how much left do they have in the tank, really, after that Texas game, which kind of is what I was saying about Virginia after the UNC massive upset as well. How much do you have left in the tank? But then Kansas State, on the other hand, might also be a little bit overrated because they blew the doors off of TCU last week, and I think a lot of people thought that would be a more competitive game. The market looked like TCU was kind of the side that was being indicated by the market there, and Kansas State just absolutely wiped them out. It was not even close. I think it was like 41-6 or something. So it's like, yeah, I don't know how much value are you really going to get in Kansas State when they're coming off such a blowout win over a team that was the runner-up in college football last year, made the championship last year. TCU, I don't know how much of that mystique, I guess, has faded from TCU with the way that they played even prior to that game this year, though they haven't looked that good. They certainly have not looked like a playoff team whatsoever. So that Colorado upset over them in week 1 certainly does not look great or even look good at all, really. At this point, there's not much that you can take away from that at this point. So I don't know how much stock you can put into Kansas State mopping the floor with TCU, but TCU is still a team that kind of carries some weight, some gravitas in the name. I don't know, but Houston's in such a tough spot that I think I would lean Kansas State there to some extent, but those other reasons that I just stated would keep me off of that. I'm finally done. I'll shut up. I think that is going to finally do it. Now this is officially the longest Better Off Dead, an hour-long college football show. Gave you a bunch of those leans there and my feelings on a bunch of those other games. I just wanted to do it, just show you what my thought process is. And once again, my plays this week: North Carolina State, NC State +10, Louisville -4, Cal +10.5, and Kentucky +4. That's going to do it. I'm Tower Gang Toad. I'm the host of Better Off Dead, of course, which is this show, and I am indeed Better Off Dead. I'm going to be completely dead by the time I do my NFL show, which I still have to do next, but that should be shorter because there are fewer games to talk about. I could talk about this shit all night, baby. I love it. I'm passionate about it. I love it, but the NFL will be a smaller card to have to deal with, so it's got to be a shorter video, I would think, even though I think last week I might have gone longer with the NFL video somehow, because I had 4 NFL plays, but it's looking like that's not going to be the case this week, so I can tell you that right now. Better Off Dead, baby. I'll put the NFL video up probably a little bit later tonight as well. You can follow me, Tower Gang Toad, on Twitter. Find me on the Tower Gang Podcast. We're the most hilarious, most offensive podcast that has ever been made by humanity. We just did an episode tonight with the great Owen Benjamin, one of my favorite comedians in existence. He is hilarious. He is a savage. He doesn't give a crap. We don't give a shit about offending people, baby. Tonight, that was a monster episode, crazy episode. Go find us on Rumble, YouTube, Odyssey, Spotify. I think I already uploaded the episode to Spotify. Just find us wherever. Tower Gang, baby. Tower Gang Pod almost everywhere. And you can support us on Locals as well at towergang.locals.com if you want to send us some money. Once again, I'm Toad, the host of Better Off Dead. I am the hilarious, autistic sports bettor that you love to hate and hate to love. Peace.